The Last Train. Chapter 1. A Chance Encounter. The clock in the station ticked towards midnight. The cold wind howled through the empty platforms, sending a shiver down Ivan's spine as he hurried through the dimly lit corridors. He had never liked train stations at night, the way they seemed to stretch on endlessly, their shadows hiding who knew what in the dark corners. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was determined to make it to the last train out of the city. Ivan wasn't sure what had brought him to this point. Perhaps it was the pressure at work or the constant arguments at home. Perhaps it was the suffocating feeling that his life was slowly slipping away from him. Whatever the reason, he had made up his mind. He was leaving. The last train, bound for a small town in the north, was his only hope. It was a place where he could start over, away from the problems that had plagued him for so long. He imagined a new life where he could breathe freely, where the weight of the world wouldn't press so heavily on his shoulders. As he reached the platform, Ivan saw a small group of people standing near the edge, their faces obscured by shadows. They were a strange assortment, an old woman hunched over with a cane, a young couple whispering to each other, and a man in a long coat with a hat pulled low over his face. He couldn't help but feel uneasy as he approached, but he pushed the feeling aside. This was his only chance to leave. The train rolled in with a deafening screech, its rusted wheels grinding against the rails. It was an old, decrepit thing, more reminiscent of a bygone era than the modern, sleek trains that usually traversed the lines. The doors creaked open with a groan, and Ivan hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The interior of the train was just as worn as the outside. The seats were tattered, the lights flickering, and the air was thick with the smell of must and decay. It was as if the train had been forgotten by time, left to rot on the tracks until someone like Ivan was desperate enough to board. He found a seat near the back, away from the other passengers, and settled in. The train lurched forward, and he felt a strange sense of relief as they left the station. He was finally leaving, finally escaping. But as the train picked up speed, the sense of relief began to fade, replaced by a gnawing unease. The train felt wrong, the way it moved, the sounds it made. It was too old, too decrepit to be running so smoothly, and yet it was. The windows rattled as they sped through the night, the world outside a blur of darkness. Ivan tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself that it was just his nerves. He was leaving everything behind, of course. He felt uneasy. But as the train sped on, the feeling only grew stronger. The other passengers sat in silence, their faces turned away from him, as if they were deliberately avoiding his gaze. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the creaking of the metal seemed to echo in his ears. Ivan tried to distract himself, but every time he closed his eyes, he felt as if the train was pulling him deeper into some unknown abyss. He finally gave up on sleep and stared out the window, though there was little to see. The world outside was an endless stretch of darkness, punctuated only by the occasional flash of light from a distant station they passed without stopping. It was as if the train was the only thing left in the world, a lone vessel hurtling through the night. The old woman suddenly turned to him, her eyes piercing through the gloom. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rattling of the train. Ivan blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "What?" "You shouldn't be on this train," she repeated, her voice trembling. "It's not meant for you." He stared at her, trying to make sense of her words, but she turned away, hunching over her cane once more. The young couple didn't react, still whispering to each other, and the man in the hat remained motionless. A chill ran down Ivan's spine, and he looked away, trying to dismiss the old woman's words as the ramblings of someone senile. But the unease gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Chapter 2. The First Stop. The train rattled on, plunging further into the night. Ivan couldn't remember how long they had been traveling. Time seemed to stretch and warp, hours blending into minutes, minutes into seconds. It was as though the train existed in a place where time had no meaning, where the normal rules of the world no longer applied. At some point, the train began to slow, and Ivan felt a small flicker of hope. Perhaps they were reaching their destination, perhaps this nightmare was almost over. But as the train came to a stop, the flicker of hope died. They were in the middle of nowhere. The train had halted in front of an old, abandoned station, its crumbling walls covered in ivy and moss. The platform was overgrown, the windows shattered, and there was no sign of life anywhere. It was as if the station had been forgotten by the world, left to decay in the wilderness. The doors creaked open, but no one moved. The other passengers remained in their seats, their eyes fixed on the floor, as if they were waiting for something. Ivan glanced around, unsure of what to do. Should he get off? Stay on the train? The old woman's warning echoed in his mind, and he hesitated. Suddenly, the man in the hat stood up. He moved with a deliberate slowness, as if every step required immense effort. Without a word, he walked to the door and stepped out onto the platform. The doors began to close behind him, but at the last moment, he turned back to look at Ivan. There was something in his gaze, something that made Ivan's blood run cold. It was a look of recognition, as if the man had been expecting him all along. And then the door shut, and the train began to move again, leaving the station behind. Ivan sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man had left without a word, without even a glance at the other passengers. It was as if he had been there for one reason only, and now that reason was gone. The train picked up speed, and the abandoned station disappeared into the darkness. Ivan felt a growing sense of dread. What kind of train was this? Where was it taking him? And who were these people that seemed so content to sit in silence, as if they were all resigned to their fate? He turned to the old woman, hoping she might have some answers, but she was asleep, her head resting against the window. The young couple was still whispering to each other, their voices too low for him to hear. He was alone in his fear, with no one to turn to. As the train sped through the night, Ivan couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. He had been so eager to leave, so desperate to escape his life, that he had boarded a train without thinking, without questioning where it was going. And now he was trapped, hurtling towards an unknown destination with no way to turn back. Chapter 3. A Familiar Face. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. The train seemed to exist in a void, where time and space lost all meaning. Ivan had given up trying to keep track of how long they had been traveling, the world outside a blur of darkness. And then, without warning, the train began to slow again. Ivan's heart raced as he looked out the window. They were approaching another station, but this one was different. Unlike the abandoned station they had passed earlier, this one was brightly lit, the platform crowded with people. It was a scene of normalcy that seemed out of place after the eerie silence of the night. As the train came to a stop, the doors opened with a soft hiss, and the passengers began to board. Ivan watched them closely, hoping for some sign that things were returning to normal. But as each person entered the train, he felt a growing sense of unease. They were all familiar faces. Ivan couldn't place where he had seen them before, but there was no denying it. Each passenger that boarded the train was someone he knew, an old classmate, a colleague from work, a neighbor he hadn't spoken to in years. They moved with the same deliberate slowness as the man who had left earlier, their expressions blank, their eyes empty. One by one, they took their seats, filling the train with an eerie silence. None of them acknowledged Ivan, their gazes fixed on some distant point, as if they were all lost in their own thoughts. It was as if they didn't even see him, as if he were invisible. Ivan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. What was happening? Why were these people here? He had left the city to escape, to get away from everything and everyone, and yet here they were, boarding the same train as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He tried to catch the eye of one of the passengers, a woman he vaguely remembered from his office. But she didn't even glance in his direction, her face expressionless as she took a seat near the front of the car. The train doors closed, and they began to move again. Ivan's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had left everything behind, had boarded this train to escape his life, and yet here he was, surrounded by the very people he had been trying to leave. It didn't make any sense. None of it made any sense. The old woman suddenly stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around, her gaze lingering on the new passengers before settling on Ivan. "I warned you," she said softly, her voice filled with regret. "This train, it's not meant for you." Ivan stared at her, his mind racing. "What do you mean? Why are all these people here?" The old woman sighed, a deep, weary sound. "This train, it's for those who have lost their way. For those who are trying to escape something, but don't realize that what they're running from is inside them." Ivan shook his head, trying to understand. "But I just wanted to leave, to start over. I didn't want any of this." The old woman's eyes were filled with a sadness that seemed to go beyond her years. "You can't escape your past, no matter how far you run. This train, it's a reflection of your soul, of the things you've been trying to avoid. And now it's taking you where you need to go." Ivan felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "Where is that?" The old woman didn't answer, her gaze drifting away as if she had already said too much. The train rattled on, plunging deeper into the night, and Ivan felt a growing sense of panic. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know what awaited him at the end of this journey. But he had a terrible feeling that it was something he couldn't escape. Chapter 4. The Truth Unveiled. The train continued its relentless journey, the world outside a blur of darkness punctuated only by the occasional flicker of light from passing stations. Each time they stopped, more passengers would board, and each time, Ivan recognized more familiar faces. They were people from his past, people he had tried to forget, people he had hurt or been hurt by. The young couple who had been whispering earlier had stopped talking altogether. They sat in silence, their hands clasped together, their faces drawn with an expression Ivan couldn't quite place. Resignation, perhaps, or maybe it was something deeper, something darker. The old woman had fallen silent again, her eyes closed as if she were trying to shut out the world. Ivan wanted to shake her, to demand answers, but something held him back. A part of him was afraid of what she might say, afraid of the truth he was starting to piece together. It was during one of the train's longer pauses that Ivan finally gathered the courage to speak. He turned to the young couple, hoping they might offer some insight. "Do you know where this train is going?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The woman turned to him, her eyes wide and haunted. "We're going to where it all ends," she said softly. Ivan felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" The man squeezed her hand, his expression grim. "This train, it's not just a train. It's a passage, a journey through the shadows of our pasts. It takes us to where we need to face the truth, to confront what we've been running from." Ivan swallowed hard. "And then what?" The woman looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "Then we have to make a choice." A choice. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Ivan didn't know what kind of choice they were talking about, but he knew it was something he wasn't ready to face. The train jerked forward again, and the familiar faces outside the window blurred into a smear of memories. Ivan's thoughts raced. If this train was a journey through his past, then what was he supposed to confront? What truth was waiting for him at the end? He thought of all the things he had tried to escape, his failed relationships, his mistakes, the regrets that had haunted him for years. He had thought he could leave it all behind, but now it seemed that everything he had tried to bury was rising to the surface, demanding to be faced. As they neared another station, Ivan noticed something strange. The station was identical to the one they had just left. The same crumbling walls, the same broken windows, the same overgrown platform. It was as if they had gone in a circle, returning to the same place over and over again. The train came to a stop, and the doors opened. Ivan watched as more passengers boarded, their faces twisted in fear and confusion. He recognized them all, people from his past, people he had wronged, people who had wronged him. He realized with a start that the train wasn't just taking him through his memories. It was bringing his memories to him, forcing him to confront each one, to relive the pain and regret that he had tried so hard to forget. The old woman opened her eyes again, her gaze settling on Ivan. "You have to face it," she said quietly. "Whatever it is you're running from, you have to face it. Only then can you move on." Ivan felt a lump form in his throat. "And if I don't?" The old woman didn't answer. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said it all. Chapter 5: The Final Destination. The train began to slow once more, but this time, Ivan knew it was different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of finality that hadn't been there before. The other passengers shifted in their seats, their faces drawn with a mixture of fear and resignation. They knew, just as Ivan did, that they were nearing the end. The station they arrived at was unlike any of the others. It was grand, imposing, with towering columns and a vast, empty platform. The lights were dim, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. There was a sense of emptiness, of something vast and unknowable waiting just beyond the edge of sight. The doors opened, and for a moment no one moved. The silence was thick, oppressive, as if the very air was waiting for something to happen. Then, slowly, the passengers began to rise from their seats, moving towards the doors with a kind of solemn determination. Ivan hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to stay on the train, to avoid whatever awaited him on that platform. But he knew he couldn't. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. As he stepped onto the platform, he felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind, but it was tempered by a quiet resolve. Whatever was waiting for him, he would face it. He had no other choice. The platform was empty, save for a single door at the far end. It was an ordinary door, wooden with a simple brass handle, but it seemed to pulse with an energy that made Ivan's skin crawl. He knew, without being told, that this was the final destination. This was where he would find the truth. The other passengers filed towards the door, their faces expressionless. Ivan followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he would find on the other side, but he knew it was something he couldn't avoid. As he reached the door, the old woman appeared beside him. She looked up at him with sad, knowing eyes. "This is it," she said softly. "Whatever you find in there, you have to face it. It's the only way to move on." Ivan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling slightly, and pushed the door open. Chapter 6: Confrontation. Beyond the door was a small, dimly lit room. It was empty, save for a single chair in the center, facing a large mirror that covered the entire opposite wall. The mirror was old and tarnished, its surface mottled with age, but it reflected the room with eerie clarity. Ivan stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing him in. He was alone, with nothing but his reflection for company. He approached the chair, his heart pounding in his chest. The mirror loomed before him, its surface cold and unyielding. He could see himself clearly, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. But there was something else in the reflection, something that made his blood run cold. It was the man in the hat, standing behind him, his face obscured by shadow. Ivan spun around, but the room was empty. He turned back to the mirror, and there the man was again, his dark silhouette looming over Ivan's reflection. His presence was suffocating, filling the room with a sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. "Who are you?" Ivan whispered, his voice trembling. The man in the mirror didn't respond. He simply stood there, silent and menacing, his hat casting a long shadow over his face. Ivan felt a wave of panic. This was it. This was what he had been running from, the thing he had been trying to avoid all along. But now it was here, staring him in the face, demanding to be acknowledged. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "What do you want from me?" The man in the mirror slowly removed his hat, revealing a face that was both familiar and alien. It was Ivan's own face, but twisted, distorted, a reflection of all the darkness and fear he had tried to bury deep inside. "You can't run from yourself," the reflection said, its voice low and echoing. "No matter how far you go, no matter how fast you run, you will always carry the darkness with you." Ivan stared at his reflection, his mind racing. "But I don't want this. I don't want to be like this." The reflection smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down Ivan's spine. "You have no choice. The darkness is a part of you. You can't escape it. You can only confront it." The reflection smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold indifference. "I won't accept that. Then you will remain trapped. I won't let the darkness define me. Forever a prisoner of your own making." Ivan clenched his fists, his mind racing. He didn't want to be trapped, didn't want to be a prisoner of his own fears and regrets. But how could he confront something that seemed so all-encompassing, so overwhelming? He looked into the eyes of his reflection, seeing all the pain, all the mistakes, all the regrets that had brought him to this point. He saw the darkness that had grown inside him, fed by years of running, of avoiding the truth. But he also saw something else. He saw a glimmer of hope, a small, fragile light that had somehow survived despite everything. It was the part of him that still believed in redemption, that still believed he could change, could be better. "I'm not afraid of you," Ivan said, his voice steadying. "You're a part of me, yes, but you don't define me. I can choose to be better. I can choose to confront my fears, my mistakes, and learn from them." The reflection's eyes narrowed, but it said nothing. Ivan took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the mirror. "I'm not running anymore. I'm going to face whatever comes, and I'm going to move on. I'm going to find my own path, my own way forward." The reflection stared at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, it began to fade. The darkness in the mirror receded, leaving only Ivan's own reflection staring back at him, whole and unbroken. Ivan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The room seemed to brighten, the oppressive weight lifting from his shoulders. He had faced the darkness, had confronted the parts of himself he had tried to run from for so long. And he had survived. The door behind him creaked open, and Ivan turned to see the old woman standing in the doorway. She smiled, a warm, knowing smile that filled him with a sense of peace. "You did well," she said softly. "You faced your fears, and now you can move on." Ivan nodded, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. "What happens now?" The old woman stepped aside, revealing a bright, sunlit path beyond the door. "Now you go forward. The past is behind you. The future is yours to shape." Ivan smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He took a step towards the door, towards the light, and as he did, he felt the last remnants of fear and doubt fall away. He was ready to move on. Epilogue, a new beginning. The train pulled into the final station, its journey complete. The passengers stepped off one by one, their faces serene, their burdens lifted. Ivan was the last to leave, his steps sure and steady as he walked towards the sunlight that awaited him. The station was empty now, the train silent and still. But it was not abandoned. It was waiting, as it always had, for the next traveler who would need to take the journey, to confront their own darkness, and to find their own path forward. Ivan didn't look back as he stepped into the light. The past was behind him, and the future stretched out before him, filled with possibility. He was free, and as the train prepared for its next journey, it knew that it had fulfilled its purpose once more. It had carried another soul through the night, through the shadows of fear and regret, and brought them safely to the dawn of a new day. For that was the train's purpose, and it would continue to fulfill it, for as long as there were those who needed its passage. And so the train waited, silent and patient, ready for the next traveler who would board, and the next story that would unfold.